We began this series with the question, is there a God? Richard Swinburne argues that the answer is yes because theism provides the best explanation for a variety of phenomena, including the existence of our physical universe, the most general or fundamental laws of nature that operate within our universe, the evolution of humans and animals, the consciousness of humans, the opportunity humans have to mold their characters and significantly impact the world, and the reports of miracles and religious experiences. In this video, I'll summarize why Swinburne thinks these first two phenomena provide evidence for the existence of God. In future videos, we'll discuss the others in the list. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Before explaining how these first two phenomena provide evidence for theism, let's be clear about what exactly that evidence is. What is the universe, and what is a law of nature? Our universe is, or at least contains, an enormous number of physical objects, each at some distance and direction from each other. These physical objects have causal powers and liabilities. For example, a piece of copper has the power to expand and the liability to exercise that power under certain conditions, namely when it is heated. A law of nature is just a regularity in the causal powers and liabilities of various kinds of objects. The powers and liabilities of large-scale objects, like a piece of copper or an oak tree, derive from the powers and liabilities of the small-scale objects that compose them, like atoms, and ultimately fundamental particles. So not only is there an enormous number of objects, but they all behave in certain respects in exactly the same way. Every fundamental particle of a certain kind has exactly the same powers and liabilities as every other particle of that kind. For example, each electron has the same causal powers and liabilities as every other electron in the universe. Regularities in the causal powers and liabilities of the most fundamental inanimate objects, whatever they turn out to be, is what Swinburne has in mind when he refers to the most general laws of nature. Now, how is the existence of our universe and the most general laws of nature evidence for theism? The short answer is that theism better explains these phenomena than naturalism, based on the criteria we discussed in the second video of this series. Let's begin by unpacking the theistic explanation for these phenomena, then turn to the naturalistic explanation of these phenomena. If there is a God of the kind described in the first video in this series, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly free, then this God could bring it about that there is a physical universe and that there are such laws. How likely is it that God would do such a thing? It doesn't seem terribly unlikely, and perhaps even probable. Here's why. There are many good worlds God has reason to create. Among them are ones in which there are creatures with significant freedom to choose between good and evil, and the power to make a deeply significant difference to themselves, each other, and the world by those choices. However, such creatures would need to be finite and limited, because it would not be good to create these kinds of beings with unlimited power to do evil. Additionally, if humans are to be able to make such choices, which affect each other, they must be able to get a hold of each other and do things to each other, which means they need a public location. And if they are to only have limited powers, they must have a limited public location, which means they need bodies. Without bodies, we couldn't embrace others, give them food to keep them alive, and help meet their physical needs. Our bodies allow us to be a part of a mutually dependent community. But our bodily movements need to have predictable effects. And this means that the world needs to have regularities, simple laws of nature that such bodily creatures can discover and use to make a difference to things. With such knowledge, they can choose what kind of difference they will make, whether good or bad. For example, they can learn that if you plant seeds and water them, they will grow into edible plants, which will enable you to keep yourself and others alive. They can also learn that if you point a loaded gun at someone and pull the trigger, it can kill them. The main idea is this. God has good reasons to create embodied beings with significant freedom. But a necessary condition of such beings is a physical universe with simple laws of nature they can discover and use to predict the effects of their actions. The fact that there is a physical universe at all, and that its most general laws of nature are simple, is not surprising on theism. To some extent, theism leads us to expect these phenomena. Recall from the previous video that theism is also a simple hypothesis. Since theism leads us to expect these phenomena, and since theism is a simple hypothesis, Theism satisfies the criteria we discussed in the second video of this series, making it a good explanation. Now, let's consider how likely these phenomena are on naturalism. Recall from the previous video that on naturalism, the ultimate explanation, the thing or things on which everything else depends, is inanimate, not personal. It turns out then that both of these phenomena are inexplicable. Why? Think about the present state of the universe. Call it S1. S1 is a particular arrangement of physical objects in space at a particular time. Science can explain S1 in terms of a prior state, S2, and some law, L, which made S2 bring about S1. But no matter how far back this chain goes, whether finite or infinite, all science can explain are specific states of the universe. It cannot explain why there is a universe at all, or any states at all. To put it another way, science can explain why such an enormous number of physical objects are arranged the way they are, but it cannot explain why there are any physical objects at all on which the laws of nature operate. Similarly, while we can explain less fundamental laws, L1, by more fundamental laws, L2, there cannot be an inanimate explanation of the most general laws of nature, G. Inanimate explanations end there because there are no further causal powers and liabilities to cite. So, we are left with two phenomena that theism can explain and naturalism cannot. You might think that theism is therefore the better explanation. But the naturalists can push back here. Surely their ultimate brute fact, an orderly universe, is no more problematic than Swinburne's ultimate brute fact, God. Well, simplicity plays a very important role here. Swinburne thinks that God is a simpler ultimate brute fact than an orderly universe like our own. To see why, recall that today's universe consists of an enormous number of things of different kinds. Science demands that we postulate the smallest number of brute facts. If we can explain the many bits of the universe by one simple thing, which keeps them in existence, we should do so, even if, inevitably, we cannot explain the existence of that simple being. Yet, not only is there an enormous number of things, but they all behave, in certain respects, in exactly the same way. There is a uniformity in the powers and liabilities of these different kinds of objects. This uniformity cries out for explanation, some source that causes the uniformity. For example, every cell in our body has the same DNA sequence. Scientists don't look at this phenomena and say, well, such uniformity in every cell is quite simple, so there is no need for further explanation. Instead, they look for an explanation of the uniformity, namely that all of our cells and the DNA inside them derive from a single cell, a zygote. Similarly, an archaeologist who's discovered that all the coins at a particular dig site have the same markings on them looks for an explanation of the uniformity in these markings, some source, perhaps a person who created the coins. On theism, God is the single source that explains the uniformity in the powers and liabilities of physical objects. On naturalism, such uniformity seems like a giant coincidence, crying out for explanation where there is none. Perhaps the naturalist can posit such a source, a single, unextended point-like object in the distant past, endowed with the power to decay into innumerable objects of very few kinds, and the liability to exercise that power at some time or other. How does this inanimate explanation compare to theism? Well, there are many alternative powers and liabilities such an initial singular object could have had. It could have had no powers and no liabilities, or powers but no liabilities to exercise them unless interfered with, or merely the power and liability to keep itself in being, or the power and liability to produce only identical substances such that you never get enough variation to produce creatures like us. And the list could go on. It's not clear that simplicity alone can determine which of these variants is the most probable one. And many variants of this initial singularity, although relatively simple, do not lead to a continuing universe with simple laws or a sufficiently varied universe. The main idea I'm getting at is this. The unextended point the naturalist posits turns out to have certain ways of developing built into it that aren't as simple as they could be, and no reason why those particular ways of developing should be built into it rather than any other ways. This kind of complexity built into the hypothesis makes it less simple. By contrast, theism posits just one very simple kind of thing. In fact, the simplest kind of person there can be, as I argued in the previous video. And theism leads us to expect that a universe will be produced in which many substances of few kinds have all the same powers and liabilities. Since theism is a simpler hypothesis that better leads us to expect these two phenomena, theism is the better explanation. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. Let me know your thoughts about Swinburne's argument in the comments. If you value this content and you'd like to see more animated videos in the future, please consider becoming a patron. The link to become a patron is in the description of the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.